war is associated with a loss of control by the government. It loses the power to tax and regulate. And that is exactly what happened in Peru. As the military goes into these areas, they are basically, no-go zones. And I think that was a big contributing factor to the inflation. The Peruvian economy stabilized for a reason. It wasn't just they stopped printing money. It was the conditions became such that it was possible to stabilize the economy, that it was possible to start collecting taxes in certain places again, or start building institutions. You cannot start building an economy without having stability and resolving particularly violent internal conflicts.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard my co-host, Patricia Pino, and in a moment, I'm going to be talking to her about a paper she wrote on the short-term economic impact of the internal conflict in Peru over the period from 1980 to 2000. For newer listeners, as I often do, I've linked to our episodes about how governments spend from an introductory level to a more in-depth level in the show notes for this episode. But it's not an oversimplification to say that currency issuing governments, such as those of the UK, the US, Japan, Canada, Australia, and many more, spend new money into existence when they spend and delete already existing money out of existence when they tax. This is not a proposal that money systems should be run this way. This is a description of how already existing fiat currency systems work. But because this means that governments that issue their own currency can't run out of money, in other words, their spending is not revenue constrained, that leads some people to be concerned about inflation, and that's understandable. And so I've also linked to our episodes that help with understanding inflation and hyperinflation. Lastly, before we dive in, a quick announcement that Modern Money Lab and Torrens University in Australia have launched a set of online graduate and postgraduate courses in modern monetary theory and ecological economics, and enrollments are now open. So I've linked to where you can find out more about those in the show notes for this episode, where, as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month, or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT Podcast. I'm Christian Riley, and I'm delighted to be joined today by MMT scholar, writer, and co-host of the MMT Podcast, Patricia Pino. Hi, P.
Hi, pleasure to be here, as always.
So, Patricia, we're going to be talking about your recent paper entitled The Short-Term Economic Impact of Peru's Internal Conflict, which focuses on Peru over the period between 1980 and 2000. And as you write, that was a time of deep economic crisis in Peru, and you've analysed it here. But also, one of the great things about this is we get to talk to you personally, and you personally lived through some of this at a very young age. So start anywhere and just tell us what you remember about it.
I was a toddler. I was born in 1984, and the decade of the 80s in Peru is sort of regarded as the lost decade because it was probably the deepest economic crisis Peru has ever had. And when you see the drop in GDP, it's almost like 50%. I think it's thereabouts of the Great Depression, if not more than that. Many economists have looked at that period and tried to understand the causes for it, because there doesn't seem to be one single explanation for what happened, because something that big can only be the result of a compounded effect of various different things joining in together. But being born into it, of course, you don't know any better. I think I came to realize as I grow older, I spent most of my very early age and even to my teen years through that crisis. And it was only as things got progressively better that I realized that what we had been through as a country wasn't normal. And a child doesn't know any better. So they just think things are normal. I remember from a very, very early age, discussions about security took a big part of our daily conversations or family conversations.
When you talk about security, you don't mean social security, you mean actual bodily harm.
I mean, actually not trying to die in a bomb attack that day and what measures to take in order to be as safe as possible. Knowing that, of course, you had to put food on the table, you had to make sure that you earned enough to feed your family. And in my case, my parents, they were the first generation of their families that were educated at university. So they both were early in their careers and it was not a good time to start your career. And my mother is an architect, but she was for the most part making money here and there, trying to put traffic lights, which is not what architects imagine themselves doing, but she had to do it just because there was nothing else, basically. And my dad was an engineer, but he worked as a taxi driver to make ends meet for a while. It was really desperate day-to-day survival mode. And apart from that, there was all this sense that talk about our security, myself and my sisters at the time, of where we were going to be. We weren't allowed to go to certain places. We couldn't just walk out in the street. It was just not something that you did. And I got used to, I guess, living in this environment, which turns out very oppressive as you grow older because you can't do anything without security being an issue. But yeah, you don't know any better. And it was only when I grew older that I become to understand things that I heard on the news or what the source of the turmoil was. And I guess growing older, I began to understand a few things. During the 80s, we had the compounded problems of terrorism as well as economic instability. We had hyperinflation. And I started to look for answers to this and specifically to make my memories match to the explanation, to fit them within a timeline. And the explanations that I had just didn't seem sufficient. For example, I remember hyperinflation being a big issue when I was growing up. And my dad happened to have his wages indexed because he worked for the state for a while. So that was lucky. And then I realized that was extremely lucky for my family. But I remember my mom making comments about how they calculated his wages every day in order to increase them by the right amount. And I didn't think anything of it until I began to understand the hyperinflationary process.
Warren Mosler will say indexation is going to cause the inflation as well, right?
Yeah, it's going to perpetuate it or exacerbate it, I think.
Because really it's the government paying a higher price for the same thing that it paid yesterday.
Yeah, but it wasn't everybody in the economy who has their wages index. It was a select few. And it just so happened that my dad, the particular job that he had, allowed for this. So as I said, it was extremely lucky. But for the most part of Peru, for the vast majority of Peruvians, your wages were worth half the day after. It was desperate. So when I was looking for explanations for the whole period, all that I found was, Peru's hyperinflation was caused by printing money. And it's a very simplistic thing. And knowing how chaotic all that period was, that the explanation just didn't seem sufficient to me.
I always go back to the title of Clint Ballinger's piece where he writes, airplane crashes aren't hyperlandings, because I think that nails the problem. It's the language itself is why people think that inflation leads to hyperinflation. That hyperinflation is just the same as inflation, but on a grand scale. Whereas in fact, inflation is very commonplace and even actually a desired policy target. But because we've got this phenomenon that we're about to describe and we've chosen to call it hyperinflation, people think that inflation itself leads to hyperinflation. The hyperinflation is just a consequence of unchecked inflation. And if inflation's pretty normal and common and it's everywhere, and hyperinflation is just the next phase of inflation, then all monetary economies are in danger of hyperinflation at all times.
Exactly. So the government of Peru just one day decided they were going to print a ton of money,
When an airplane crashes, people don't go, well, the pilot must have just landed really hard. It's a hyperlanding. They look for what may have caused the plane crash. And with hyperinflation, you've got to look beyond well, there's a lot of currency and the currency isn't worth anything. So the lots of currency thing must have caused the not worth anything thing. That's like saying the hard landing caused the plane crash. That the causation is going from in hyperinflation. Well, you can tell me if this is what you found, but the way I understand it, causation goes from there's a sharp currency depreciation caused by something that definitely needs recognizing and discussing and fixing, but the sharp depreciation comes first, and then the sharp increase in money issuance comes after that, because now the economy needs more money to keep up with demand. Just like you were talking about with your dad having his wages index, now the economy needs more money in it to keep up with the demand because everything keeps getting dramatically more expensive. So you've got to look to the root cause of the depreciation or causes.
You've got to look for the shock.
And it's always a huge traumatic thing generally, or things plural.
In the case of Peru, it was things plural. It was a combination of that. But what prompted me, I guess, to write the paper was because in the explanations for hyperinflations, and I did a lot of research as to, hyperinflations in different parts of the world. And there was a really good paper and several papers that borrowed from that paper because it was so good, that talked about hyperinflations being primarily the result of, as you say, huge shocks, mostly related to war, very often related to war. And then it said the exception being Peru. And yeah, I had the same reaction. Really? So maybe Peru's war wasn't what you would expect a country from country war. It was more of an internal civil war. But I think there is a real gap in there. There's a real, I don't know if it's denialism about it, but the fact that they don't even register it they register it as a political event, as a significant political event, but they don't register it as a significant economic effect. And they almost regard it as a result of the economic mismanagement, as opposed to as a key contributor to the whole economic chaos. And that's what prompted me wanting to investigate that period. And initially, as I said before, I wanted to look at what caused inflation in Peru. I wanted to look at the whole hyperinflationary process and do a study on that. I found very quickly that it was extremely complex because of all the factors weighing in. And then I decided to scale it back and focus specifically on the impact of the internal conflict itself.
Moving on to what you know about it now as a student, let's talk about the economic and political landscape of Peru. What were things like before the turmoil? What gave rise to it?
Peru was going through a time of political changes, significant political changes from the 1950s, 1960s, and into the 1970s. And for example, in 1968, we had sort of a feudal system in Peru, which was, I guess, typical of many other countries at the time. And it was really a leftover from the colonial times, where you have mostly white people owning quite a lot of land. And then indigenous people of Peru were mostly kind of allowed to work that land in exchange for a cut of what the landowner produced. So that there was increasing calls in Peru for redistribution of land. And these voices became louder and louder and louder. And for the most part, this movement was peaceful. But there were instances where it's not that they used violence, but there was a threat of violence. But I don't want to claim that, one side was violent and the other wasn't. The landowners, by all means, maintained this system through themselves using the threat of violence, even if violence itself was just something that hang over you rather than something that happened every day. But there were sort of guerrilla groups or smaller kind of syndicates that what they would do would be to occupy land and demand that it was redistributed. And these voices were largely successful at putting pressure on the government. And it seemed like to the point where most landowners had realized that this was a battle that they couldn't win, that the distribution of land was inevitable. And there were a lot of people, they resisted it and they tried to water it down, but there was a huge sense that it just had to be done. It was just becoming more and more difficult to justify. So in 1968, things were at their peak in terms of more and more kind of occupation of land happened. And the president that we had back then, called Belaunde, he was center-right, I would say kind of liberal economically. And he was perceived as not doing enough. And he was really not doing enough. The guerrilla groups were getting more and more threatening in the countryside. And he decides to send the army to the countryside, headed by Velasco, General Velasco. And what Velasco realizes is that Peru needs a drastic change if it is going to avoid violence, if it is going to avoid things getting out of control. And so he decides to stage a coup against President Belaunde, and the military government begins. Now, the military government, you could call it left-wing, I guess, in the sense that, it had some aims that the left identifies with, like the redistribution of land, these aims. But I don't think that government would have necessarily regarded itself as left-wing. I think it was happy to receive the support of left-wing groups if it allowed itself to consolidate its power. But I think it perceived itself as a pragmatic government first and foremost. It was about maintaining control and maintaining peace, and they just didn't think that the president in turn was doing a very good job at it. So later on, and I'm telling you this because what happened then was actually pivotal to what happened later in the 80s. So from 1968 to the late 70s, we had the military government, and they redistributed land or most of it, and divided into smaller parcels amongst the peasant groups. So now, instead of having big landowners with workers, now you had a lot of small landowners who were mostly the farmers that worked within that land. And this is important because by the 60s, a group called Shining Path is formed. And Shining Path is inspired by the Maoist movement in China. And its leader believed that they could mobilize the Peruvian peasantry the same way that Mao mobilized the Chinese farmers against the landowners. But the issue is that by the time that they actually start activities in the 80s, the land was already redistributed. So they couldn't really do it in the same way that China had done it. And that meant that they increasingly started resorting to more and more violent means of coercion and trying to force farmers into joining their movement by fear, basically, if they couldn't have their support in any other way.
So speaking of Shining Path and their origins, you're saying that basically that their aims had already been achieved, that land had already been redistributed. So what became their objective after that? What was the change that they were trying to foment?
In terms of Shining Path's origins, there are a lot of debates as to what was the pivotal moment that created them as a group. Because as I said, there were plenty of smaller guerrilla groups, but they were not of the same nature as Shining Path. Shining Path was an actively violent and proudly so movement. And most historians, I think, have pinpointed the birth of this movement in a protest that occurred in Ayacucho in 1969, which was a protest about student fees. The new kind of government was instituted some school fees, and they were protesting about this. And the military government, being a military government, responded to the crowd, which was mostly made out of families and children, with violence and shooting and grenades. And a lot of people died. And I think that moment cemented in people this idea that if this government that was supposed to be on their side, or that claimed to be on their side, could do this, then the state itself was the enemy. And the state was not reformable, and there was nothing else to do but to destroy it. So once you've made up your mind on that, there's no going back. And the issue was that the redistribution of land was just a means to mobilize farmers, but it was by no means their sole aim. So they take another 10 years from 1969. It was in 1980 where they feel large enough and prepared enough to actually declare war on the state of Peru. And this was a movement that was initially at least composed primarily of students, university students, and intellectuals. And even though they came from poor families, they were still intellectuals. And they disrupted their communities, and their dream was to basically get the support of the peasantry, of the farmers. But I don't know if it's because of the position as intellectuals that there was a disconnect between those two worlds, and they failed in a sense to enlist their support and to convince them that they were truly on their side.
After the coup in 68, a fixed exchange regime was implemented. So I'm just going to throw this out there. You know, when you've got fixed exchange rate regime and then you throw the 1973 oil crisis on top of that, that sounds like a recipe for disaster anyway, right? You know, I guess there was a need because they were on a fixed exchange rate, I'm presuming with the US dollar. So there was a need to borrow in dollars to maintain the currency peg. So you're running up foreign debt, borrowing in a currency that you don't issue. And then that gives the IMF the leverage they need to impose austerity. Is that how it went?
You have to remember at the time, fixed exchange rates were like common knowledge, right? This was the thing that people did. But in the case of Peru, the government was very aware that quite a lot of the industry in Peru is dependent upon the availability of imports of machinery and farming is pesticides and in repairs, materials and things like that. And they felt that they needed to provide a certain degree of stability in the prices of these items in order for the economy to be able to function. So the way that they would do that would be by fixing the exchange rate and making sure that industry and farmers always had access to the dollars they needed to run their industries, right? That created, of course, other problems in the sense that you can only really maintain that for as long as you have reserves. And there is no hiding the fact that you're running out of reserves. And if people know, particularly in the 80s, the President Alan Garcia, he had a very aggressive system of subsidies for exchange rates. So the central bank would basically buy dollars at the global market rate, and then they would sell the dollars in Peru for a much cheaper rate for industrial reasons. But in the end, a lot of people were using that for their consumption. And it was clear that reserves were running out and that therefore the government couldn't maintain this for much longer. So investment wasn't coming, even though the fixed exchange rate, the subsidies that were being given alongside other policies that the president did cause kind of an improvement in living conditions and increase unemployment. And the first 2 years are fantastic, but as reserves run out, then the whole thing comes crashing down pretty fast. The main thing was that the government, having run out of reserves, it couldn't access the finance it needed to support certain industries. But also the government then starts, in order to maintain reserves, what it has to do or what it decides to do, it doesn't have to do it, but it decides to suppress imports quite violently. And they do that by reducing spending. So a lot of factories that were state-owned at the time, legacy of the military government, start closing. And you see there's news of, workers desperately begging the government to keep the factories open, but everything is closing. So that cut in spending is aimed entirely at recovering the reserves, right? The dollar reserves. But then you're also reducing your supply of goods and exacerbating the inflation in that way.
You spoke a minute ago about subsidies that Peru was receiving. So I'm just interested to know which institutions those subsidies came from, but also were there loans? Was the IMF involved?
Well, the IMF was involved, but the subsidies were subsidies that the government was giving the people of Peru to buy dollars. The issue is as well that the government, at the same time that is trying to facilitate the availability of dollars in the economy, is also having quite hostile relationships with the IMF. And this is a heterodox government. So this is a contradiction, because on the one hand, they're saying that they said to the IMF, we're not going to pay the national foreign debt anymore because, this is true. They restricted payments of foreign debt to a proportion of GDP. I think it was 10 or 5% even of GDP, a very small proportion, because they said otherwise we are impoverishing our economy and the people within it. And we need to make sure that, people in Peru have things to eat and things to consume.
No more people in Peru means no more productivity, means you're not getting your money back anyway, right?
Exactly. Yeah. But the issue is that at the same time that they're doing this and they're trying to kind of stand up to the IMF, they are, making the availability of dollars more plentiful in Peru. And as I said, maintaining this fixed exchange rate. And that means that they're just making themselves more vulnerable to the people that they are supposedly standing up to.
They also sell government bonds, right?
Yeah, they sell government bonds. I know that they offered some interest on the dollar government bonds. initially. And then they rain down on dollar deposits in Peru, and they basically block, if you have dollars in the bank, you're blocked from using them.
You know, in the case of a country selling foreign denominated debt, that is where the bond vigilantes can come in as they sense that the country's reserves of their capacity to honor their dollar debts grows. That's when they can come in and dictate terms.
As Peru is trying to get financing from the IMF because it's running out of reserves, at that point, the IMF says, you're not paying me enough of my debt, so I'm not going to lend you anymore.
Right.
And that exacerbates the problems. And that's when the government starts realizing, oh, okay, what I did had consequences. I'm now going to, run down my economy in order to be able to recover these reserves, because Peru people are basically too rich right now.
Yeah. Okay.
And we went from a boom to a collapse within a few months. And it got really bad to the point where the exchange rate just was shooting up every day, and people were ransacking shops because they couldn't afford to eat. It was chaos.
And it creates this situation where you can say, oh, look, the government thinks we're too rich, as most of the population are starving and having to loot shops to be able to survive. This goes to show what a two-tier society we've got here and how out of touch they are, and creates great conditions for an insurrection.
There was this narrative going on that people who were skeptical of the new left-wing president, Garcia, they would say, well, the good times are going to be followed by making Peruvians even poorer. So that's the narrative that they kept repeating. And in the end, sadly, they were proved right, in the sense that the problem was the exchange rate, of course, but to them, it was more about saying, well, the government does any degree of spending or any degree of looking after its people, and we're going to pay for it with more hardship and more poverty. And it's really sad, because it just kind of traps people into this mentality of there's no point in doing anything good because it's always going to end up bad. Whereas instead of looking at the exchange, realizing that it was the fixed exchange rate that was the issue, the government, of course, had money. It was not the money that was the problem. It was the dollars that it didn't have.
If at that point they decided to float their currency, would that have been a good idea?
Well, that was part of the solution, actually. They don't talk about the solution as that being a primary aspect of it, but they do mention it as and by the way, they floated the exchange rate. It's
right.
Yeah, that probably had a lot to do with it.
Right. So in terms of your analysis, in your paper, you talk about that you've looked at analysis by other authors. You note that there's a tendency across the literature about this time and place of considering the internal conflict caused by the rise of Shining Path as an inconsequential backdrop in which economic policy took place. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, I mean, in all honesty, that was the tone that I would always get, was these were the causes of the crisis. A, the government spent too much money. B, they printed money. C, the state owned too much stuff. They owned too many factories, and everybody knows the state is bad at running things. And, and by the way, there was a war going on. I mean, I'm joking now, but I just don't understand. I genuinely don't understand how somebody misses the conflict. I mean, this wasn't a one attack a week thing. I think it's worse. We had 200 bombs a week in Peru. We had the largest amount of dead people from any conflict ever in the history of Peru. We had 70,000, I believe, is about the estimate. So you have the dead, you have the damage to property and capital and all this going on due to the bombs, and plenty of smaller kind of incidents that were never reported. And you also have the fear, the insecurity, which affects, of course, investment and confidence, if anything. And aside from that, you have mass migration to the cities and just generally people basically running for their lives from various places of the most affected areas of Peru. And then how can you look at that and then say, that was, something that was probably caused by the crisis and had nothing to do in the collapse of the Peruvian economy?
It would be like looking at World War II in the UK or the US and going, in these years, domestic consumption really fell off a cliff. We don't know why.
Yeah.
and that caused World War II.
Yeah.
do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it is a bit like that.
People didn't have enough consumption goods, and they, meat and eggs were having to be rationed, and that caused World War II.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is that puzzling. And I think part of the reason is, and maybe I'm going to be a bit critical of, I can be critical of Peruvian society, and particularly Lima society, which I'm from Lima, so I can be critical. For the first part of the conflict, from the late 1980s to 1987, 88, the conflict was almost exclusively in the countryside and affected mostly farmers. And there was limited journalistic coverage of the events. And part of the reason is because the way that the government dealt with this. So just to give you, again, background, by the late 1970s, Peru goes back to democracy. That's how history presents it. The military government calls elections, and Belaunde, which, if you remember, the same president that started in late 1960s, he comes back to power in that time. And he was seen almost as a beacon of democracy as well. And the issue was that at that point, Shining Path starts their violent campaign. And again, you have probably the worst person in government to deal with this. And he doesn't take it very seriously. And I'm going to even say that most Lima people, most city people, didn't take the conflict very seriously. Some reports were coming up of violence in the countryside, particularly from Ayacucho, which is where the conflict started. And people just didn't care. People in Lima just genuinely, I don't think they cared. There was this narrative in journalism in Peru that perceives people in the countryside as being, well, uneducated and almost kind of used to violence, almost like inherently violent. And so they didn't think too much of it because they thought, well, that's the kind of conditions that they live in and that they're used to. And I think that later on, when the president, what he does is he sends the military to Peru, to the countryside. And the military makes things even worse. The main thing is they cannot distinguish members from Shining Path from ordinary civilians, and they end up killing a lot of innocent people. And the second thing is that they also don't really care about the lives of innocent people. There were a lot of human rights violations, rapes, and just indiscriminate killing being carried out by the military forces as much as by Shining Path. So at the end of the conflict, you have half and half. And the military kept these zones, once you declare a state of emergency in Peru, the military are given almost complete control of that area. And that means that it's incredibly difficult for journalists to go into the area and get any truth, because in that period, the military killed a lot of journalists as well. And they were really hostile to anybody saying anything that might put the military in a bad light. And they had complete immunity in the way that they behaved in these zones. So, I don't think that Lima people either they didn't know because journalists weren't reporting as much as they should have been reporting, but also to some extent, they just saw it as an ordinary part of these people's lives, or they just didn't care. And I say that not because, I'm from Lima and I grew up in all this. And I say that not because I want to tell them off for it. I just think that that's something that Peru probably hasn't come to terms with, of the collective responsibility that lies in people during that time. And I think it'd be good for us not to forget what happened and grow from that. But I don't see much evidence of people wanting to do that at this point.
There was a formal truth and reconciliation procedure, wasn't there, after those decades that you focus on?
There was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission carried out, and that's where I got most of my data for the study.
Right.
They did amazing work collating testimony from victims and families of victims, and they have probably the most comprehensive record of what happened during that time. And they recorded, all the incidents and corroborating a lot with many witnesses. And they were the ones that pieced together the birth of the Shining Path movement and the military response and even the political backdrop, and as well as how this affected other kind of left-wing popular movements. because there is this perception, at least in Peru at that time, there was this perception that it was the left creating this problem, that they were the terrorists because Shining Path came from a Marxist, Leninist, Maoist background. But the truth is that a lot of people who had been prominent figures in the left and, people who had organized their communities before that and were fighting for justice for various groups, they were themselves the target of Shining Path. Shining Path saw them as almost competition, and they would really intimidate them. And they ultimately did a lot of damage to the left for many, many years. But the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came in after the year 2000. So it was quite a few years after the whole thing happened.
You write in the paper that a possibility is that the concurrence of the start of Fujimori's stabilization program and the beginning of the end of the conflict made it possible for the conflict to be left out of the literature as an important factor that can explain the development of key economic variables during the crisis and its resolution. So what did that stabilization program consist of?
Fujimori actually came in promising not to change much or not to carry out an economic shock that was proposed by the other presidential candidate who was right-wing. So he managed to ride on the wave of maybe parts of the left on the basis that he was not going to make the poor pay for this crisis. By the time he gets the government, his tune changes pretty fast. And the first thing he does is something called the Fuji Shock. And it's basically an increase in prices so drastic. It was about 300% increase for energy, and cost of energy translates into the whole economy. So what you're telling people is overnight your wages are 2/3 smaller. And this had the effect of increasing prices. So you see actually a massive spike in prices at the moment that this policy is implemented. Funny enough, a spike in prices of about 300%, almost immediate. And at the same time, that has the other effect of increasing tax revenues, and therefore is a way of instituting austerity.
It increases tax revenues because...
Oh, sorry. I should have explained that by this time, the main energy company in Peru is state-owned. So the prices that the government set for oil and energy, I regard them as a tax on people. So if you are deciding to increase those prices, and part of the reason was because the oil company was making a loss because it was importing a lot of energy at this point and it was running out of equipment to be able to obtain more oil from Peru's reserves, then, you are burdening the population with this additional kind of tax on energy, effectively. And that's what increases prices. But at the same time, it is almost like a tax.
And that's called a stabilization program. Right.
I actually spoke to Fidel about this. And what he said is that during that time, apparently, there was this belief that you really had to sort of give the economy shock therapy in order to sort of kickstart the market into functioning better, right? So, yeah, I find it bizarre. But what followed was basically more austerity. They cut wages. They cut wages by a lot. They privatized tons and tons of companies. And they liberalized tons and tons of markets that previously, at least during the military regime and then following Alan Garcia's government, they were companies that Peru had set up as an effort to expand its industrial base. So Fujimori's government privatizes the vast majority of that. Amongst those, the company that my dad used to work in, and then also liberalizes exchange rates.
There you go.
But apart from that, it so happens that Fujimori comes into power in 1990. In August 1990, he institutes the shock and starts the austerity program. He also starts negotiations with the IMF. Well, in fact, the IMF was so impressed by Fujimori's measures that they are quite happy to make a deal with him. And then the other thing that happens is that in 1992, almost by luck, frankly, the police force managed to track the leader of Shining Path to his house in Lima. And the operation, funny enough, there's no bullets being fired here. They just go into the house. He just realizes it's over and they take him as prisoner. And that had a huge effect on Shining Path because by this time, the leader of Shining Path had achieved almost quasi-religious status. It was almost a sort of mythology. But then when he was captured, they saw him as a human being. And then this wave after wave of repenting Shining Path members kind of given themselves in and telling on each other. And the whole thing collapses pretty fast following his capture in 1992. And it was about at this time when you see inflation actually going down, and then a year or so later is in single digits again. So it all happens at the same time.
Right.
So it's really easy for you to ignore whatever you don't want to consider important.
In your paper, you write that specifically your paper deals with the following question. What was the direct short-term impact of the 2 decades of insurgency violence on output in Peru's economy? So tell us about that.
Part of the reason why I abandoned the whole study of inflation per se was because I didn't think that the econometrics techniques that I knew about were really any good at capturing with any degree of confidence what the source of the causes of inflation was, particularly in a scenario as complex as Peru's. So what I used an econometric technique called fixed effects to try and establish what the immediate effect, meaning within the same year of violence, was the effect of the violence on output, on specifically 2 industries, farming and mining. And the reason why I limited it to short term was because I know that there is also effects on investment that are longer term, but I really wanted just to focus on the shock. To what extent was the loss of output that could be a contributor to inflation a direct cause of the escalation of violence during that time? And I focused on 2 industries because the data I had was detailed, but only for 2 industries. And it was farming, because the farmers were the ones who were the most affected by the violence, and at least initially. And then following that, the mining industry, because the weapon of choice of Shining Path was dynamite and another explosive called ANFO, which was widely used in mining at the time. And they were known for going to mining companies and stealing and ransacking the storage of this. And there were various reports of this. And there were also a lot of reports of those attacks by Shining Path being one of the reasons, at least, that mines were being closed in various areas of Peru. So that's why I focused on those 2. And the econometric techniques that I use, I mean, to put it simply, it just tries to eliminate all other common patterns in the data to leave you just with the effect of the violence, or the correlation with the violence and your data.
Is it fair to say you're trying to construct a model to see if there's a correlation between a unit of violence and a unit of lost productive output? That's
effectively what you're trying to do. But the fixed effects model is good in cases where you don't know all the causes behind the drop in output. So there was so much going on in Peru that there was a high chance that if I was to describe a model of exchange rate plus, prices of commodities plus other factors in Peru to try and explain the drop in output, there was a high chance that I would miss something because there was so much going on. And so what the fixed effects model does, it treats the data in a way that it basically cancels out any other effect other than the one that you're interested in. So I was following the output of several key kind of food staple or farm products. And I had a lot of data on the fluctuations of output between farming products on a regional basis. And then I used data on violence, or regional data on the violence intensity, and then correlated both. And so the model basically gets rid of effects that affect all regions equally, so national effects, which could be caused by macroeconomic effects. It can also get rid of effects that are specifically related to a particular crop. So you could account for the prices of those crops as being a factor influencing the output of those crops. And it could also account for getting rid of certain regional effects. So with mining, it was easier to take into account the prices of the metals, because in mining, the price of metals is set globally and Peru has very little effect on it. So it is known that this will influence to a great extent the investment that goes into mining, and therefore the output that goes into mining, the output of the mining industry as a whole. And that was yet another factor in the whole downturn, was that global metal prices were decreasing, and that was a key Peruvian export. And I needed to find a way to get rid of that effect. And so the fixed effect model allowed me to do that.
Also from your paper, you write, and I'm going to just have to quote directly, our sensitivity analysis presented some observations for the mining sector which are worth investigating further. We find that the lagged value of insurgency violence had a larger coefficient than same period insurgency violence figures, end quote. Can you unpack that for the interested layperson? Because there's loads of really good technical language in there.
The lagged figure is just basically, it's just saying last year's figure.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So instead of this period, last periods. I think that was particularly relevant to the mining sector data in my paper. And I don't know why, but there seemed to be a stronger correlation between, say, violence this year and output next year, as opposed to violence this year and output this year. When it comes to mining, with farming, it was the other way around. The strongest correlation was this year with this year's violence. And I think to understand that, I had to get really into looking at, how the Shining Path movement worked in terms of attracting members, or how their behavior towards farmers and the mining industry was, or different characteristics between farming and mining that may be conducive to that. So, for example, with farming, the effect of violence, I think there's good reason to believe that it's pretty immediate. So a murdered farmer is an immediately loss of the whole income of the family, is a break that affects communities immediately. And that would be reflected on the economic data. Apart from that, you have, of course, the effects of migration that happen shortly after. And I think a period of 1 year of the same year of the violence would be enough to capture that. But when it came to mining, I thought it was potentially, the reason for that was potentially that companies would first respond to violence through investing more in security systems and try to fight it off for a while. And it would take a while for the corporate decision to be made to say, just close the mine, it's not worth it.
Mm-hmm. Right,
so it's not as immediate as in the farming case.
I guess mining, it's a system with infrastructure, whereas individual farmers, like you said before, that, everybody had become kind of peasant farmers, right?
Yeah, it was a much smaller scale operation than mining. Yeah, mining in Peru at that time, at least, it was mostly large scale. And there were big machineries, and Shining Path were known for damaging machineries. They wanted to overthrow the state, and they saw attacking the economic output as a key aspect of that. That's something else, actually. Apart from the violence that the movement and military inflicted on farmers, you had as well the fact that as Shining Path expanded its operations through the countryside, they would prevent farmers from selling their food to market. Their aim was to starve Lima of food from the countryside. And they would do that also by blocking roads and main roads to key markets and main roads that put the countryside in contact with Lima. Whereas in mining, I guess they weren't able to do that as easily. Right. But they still wanted to undermine the industry. They just used different methods.
If we circle back to the question that you started with, what was the direct short-term impact of the 2 decades of insurgency violence on output in Peru's economy? Can you answer that question? Or, to what extent did it impact? And what terms should we talk about it in?
As part of the study, I actually reviewed a few papers that had tried to begin to quantify what had happened. And as I said, the Truth Commission report was extremely valuable at providing testimony of how the violence, both by military and Shining Path, affected farming communities, as well as affected operations in Lima and other industrial areas of Peru. And they provide a very detailed report just on economic effects, and they discuss breakdown of communities and the migration process, the abandoning of land and things like that. And in terms of quantifying it, other papers, when they try to assess the impact, the causes of Peru's downturn, they account for all the typical things, right? They account for money printing, the deficit, and mismanagement of the exchange rate and things like that. And they put it all in an equation and they say, okay, what does it look like if I add all these things into it? And they were persistently finding that their models and all the things that they added to it, they still were not enough to explain the full drop in output. So when I tried to estimate the quantity, I also looked at other papers that looked at the effect of violence in other countries. And there were some countries, some places in India and Africa had also endured terrorism, as well as in Spain. There was an interesting study about ETA in Spain. And they always put the violence in the region of 4 to 10% of GDP, immediate impact. And I found different numbers per industry, because remember, I'm not looking at the whole economy, but I'm looking at 2 specific industries. And in farming, I think my model threw up something like 4% or thereabouts of the collapse in GDP that was as a result of the violence. So if we're talking about a 30% decrease during that time, and it was around that region, then 4% of that would be explained through the violence. That would be the interpretation. And I think in mine, it was about the same. I can't remember the exact number, but it was about 3 to 4%.
So not quite significant, in other words.
What's the effect of COVID in the UK economy? What was it? It's not far off from that, I don't think. And there were other things going on, yes. But the other significant thing for me is that if you remember a conversation we had with Sam Levy, we discussed what happens during war that makes the prices go up. And he mentioned that during war is associated as well with a loss of control by the government.
You were both talking about this, and what came out of it is it could go either way. The government could assume more power, as in the case of the US in World War II, or it could
lose. So it loses the power to tax and regulate the market in the way that we are accustomed to thinking about it. And that is exactly what happened in Peru. As the military goes into these areas, they are basically, no-go zones in Peru, these emergency places. And institutions in Peru were weak to begin with, but they did begin to lose more ground. And I think that as well was a big contributing factor to the inflation. I didn't quantify that, but I would be surprised if it wasn't.
So if I were to ask you what ended the hyperinflation?
Well, the only thing I would say was that whether any kind of measure to stabilize the economy in Peru was even possible within the context of internal conflict. So the Peruvian economy stabilized following the capture of the leader of Shining Path and the dismantling of the group for a reason. It wasn't just, they stopped printing money. No, it was firstly that the conditions then became such that it was possible to stabilize the economy, that it was possible to start collecting taxes in certain places again, or start building institutions and the reach of the state. I don't think that, you can ignore the context of war and then have a prosperous economy while all this is happening, because you cannot start building an economy without having stability and resolving internal conflicts, particularly violent internal conflicts within that economy. But if you look at the amount of strikes, the left-wing movement and this syndicate movement in Peru was far more powerful in the 1980s than it was in the 1990s when Fujimori started his stabilization program. And suddenly strikes drop. During the period of highest austerity, strikes dropped dramatically, the number of strikes. And when you read the testimonies as the reasons why, most explanations go along the side of, it's not that workers were happy. It's not that things suddenly became better. It's that they could no longer afford to strike. So what Fujimori did was effectively crush the working class in order to stabilize the economy. And sure, you can call it stabilization, but to what extent is that stable in the sense of we haven't learned from the divisions and the inequality that put Peru where it was in the first place? We simply kind of crushed our way back into returning to that.
I really like this quote from your paper, so I'm just going to read it in its entirety. Quote, finally, the main policy implication of the findings offered in this paper is that a swift resolution of the internal conflict was likely a requirement if Peru was going to have any hope of meaningful recovery from its 2-decade slump. The internal conflict ended almost by chance with the tracing and capture of Shining Path's leader by a handful of policemen who were not part of the economic nor political strategy of any of the three presidents who served during this period. It may thus highlight the importance of conflict resolution in economic stability and prosperity, and may remind others that a lot can be achieved with few resources as long as political leaders are able to identify where the key problems lie. End quote. I think that's great.
I want to give a shout out to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, which is open source for anybody to read who's interested. And I believe there is an English translation of that as well somewhere. But the main thing is that this whole period is very complex, as I've said a few times, but there is so much more to unpack here. And I think that a lot can be learned from this. So I think I'll be returning to it at some point in the future as well.
In case you don't recognize the voice from the scores of previous episodes, I've been talking to Patricia Pino, my friend and co-host of the MMT podcast. I've been talking to Patricia about her working paper, The Short-Term Economic Impact of Peru's Internal Conflicts. And you can follow her on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino to stay current with what she's up to. But until our next episode, thanks for joining me today on the MMT podcast, Patricia Pino.
Thank you.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.